she was asked to apologise. But I think she clearly didn't want to answer questions because they decided it was politically loaded. You also had members of the committee, I think, using it to have, their own pantomime monologue moments. And I think the whole thing was probably a missed opportunity in terms of learning or finding out more, for example, about redactions, what's going next with the files.
The week has been tumultuous for the PM following the fallout of the release of more Epstein files. And now it would seem that President Trump's inner circle is beginning to feel the heat. But despite the fact that President Trump himself is mentioned frequently in the files, it's his old mate and Trade Secretary Howard Lutnik who is now facing calls to resign. Now, the latest files show that the businessman had lunch with the convicted paedophile Epstein on his private island in 2012. This, of course, after Epstein's guilty plea for soliciting a minor. Let's go to Washington and check in with Katy Balls, Washington editor at The Times and The Sunday Times. Tell us, Katy, about Howard Lutnik, because he had been actually very public and very, very vociferous in his horror at the activities of Epstein.
Yes, in various interviews, but the one that particularly comes to mind is an interview last year to a podcast by the New York Post, and he told the interviewer effectively that he had been so disgusted at what he saw at Jeffrey Epstein's house in New York. He was a neighbor; he had a neighboring house to Jeffrey Epstein after a visit in 2005. That he had made a decision there and then after Jeffrey Epstein allegedly told him that he has a massage every day and the right kind of massage, that he had thereby decided to cut off contact professionally, socially, all contact. Then, of course, we get the latest and perhaps final tranche of Epstein files, 3 million files. And in those are various correspondences and now an admission by him that despite saying this, he actually went to Epstein Island and saw Jeffrey Epstein for lunch with his wife and children, as you know, in 2011, 2012, which is, of course, I think 2011, which is, of course, after Epstein's first guilty plea and conviction.
Right. I mean, it wasn't just his wife and children, but a number of nannies, which I suppose the inclusion of that detail tells us at least that the children were young enough to require nannies. Most of us wouldn't have taken our children to have lunch with that man at that time. Is he not being heavily criticised for that?
He is, and you've even had some Republicans, which I think is a key thing in terms of the political pressure to look at. So Nancy Mace, a Republican, an independently minded Republican, has said exactly what you just said, which is it wouldn't be her judgment to take the kids for lunch with Jeffrey Epstein, nannies or not. But this is certainly, I think it's been interesting being in DC, but obviously having spent a lot of time covering British politics, to see how these Epstein files are causing, chaos, changing the establishment, the royals' business, Keir Starmer's future potentially in the UK. But here in the US, I think it's been fairly muted, the effect on US politics. It's being spoken about, but the reverberations are not the same. And I think the calls for Howard Lutnik to go are probably the closest we've got to a political scandal on it. I mean, that's not to say he is going anywhere, though.
Well, no, and that's the interesting point, isn't it? I was going to ask you whether it might be considered that Howard Lutnik does go, sacrifices himself to take the heat off, shall we say, other people.
Yeah, there's no indication as of yet. We had, the Republicans speaking out are those who are seen by the White House and the administration as the ones that are not loyal enough as it is. I think some Republicans are privately unhappy about the situation and raising questions, but the White House has said they are fully behind him. Howard Lutnik is an old friend of Donald Trump's. And I think there's also probably a feeling that ousting Howard Lutnik, whether if he chose to go, wouldn't necessarily be helpful, because then it would probably move on to another target, and perhaps there'd be more questions about Donald Trump's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. Now, Donald Trump says he is completely exonerated by these files. They show that he raised concerns about Jeffrey Epstein in the past, but I think there's a feeling of, if you let one person go, where does that leave in terms of other associates, people who are in these files?
I know that in the files, allegedly, Donald Trump called the local police chief and referenced his concerns about Epstein. But lately, he has gone public and said he didn't know anything about Epstein's reputation. I mean, which version might be true?
Yeah, as you say, when this file, and it's because there are so many files, every day we're still getting new details. When this emerged, which suggested that Donald Trump had spoken his relief that the police were looking into Epstein, saying everyone knows what he's doing. There have been two ways to looking at it, and it tends to be where you sit in the media. So one side is saying, well, he said he didn't know everything, and this shows he did. But then you have the Republicans saying, well, even if he was a bit loose with the truth there, it does corroborate other stories we've heard, which is there was a point in that friendship where Donald Trump cut off contact. So perhaps he didn't say everything, but I think there is a recurring theme in these files, which is the figures who I think are facing the trickiest questions across the divide are those who kept contact after Jeffrey Epstein's first guilty plea and conviction. Howard Lutnik is in that group. At the moment, Donald Trump is not in that group. And I think that is how people in DC are at least looking at it in terms of the pressure on both.
All right, so he can go on claiming to be exonerated, but actually that is a claim he can make, but it isn't necessarily true, is it?
Well, there clearly has a friendship with Jeffrey Epstein, and there are different accounts of what he said. And if he said he didn't know everything, and there's a file saying he did, that's a question for him. But I think that if you do look at the specific questions, and those most facing the most serious ones, it is clearly, if you're going to rank it in terms of who faces the biggest question on the Epstein files, the biggest questions are for those who continue to associate with a man after a guilty plea. And they can say, as is the case of Peter Mandelson, for example, oh, it was a terrible mistake. I shouldn't have believed him. I was naive. But that's where I think the real questions of judgment. But I think the whole files obviously raise questions for an entire establishment, particularly if you were rich and powerful in the 90s who associated with this man. And there clearly were telltale signs before that conviction too.
I don't know, I'm sure you did watch the Attorney General Pam Bondi's appearance before the House Judiciary Committee yesterday. Her demeanour is always pretty extraordinary to British eyes, I have to say. But yesterday I thought she was particularly dire. I think she accused one Democrat of being a washed-up loser lawyer. It didn't really scream, we've got nothing to hide. What do you think?
Yeah, so it was a 5 hour hearing. I watched a lot of it. I think a few minutes probably went missing in that period, but I think clearly Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, went in deciding attack was the best form of defense. And therefore we had a 5 hour appearance where I actually learned very little. And I think you had victims sat in the room who spoke of their unhappiness with the Attorney General's responses. She was asked to apologize, but I think she clearly didn't want to answer questions because they decided it was politically loaded. You also had members of the committee, I think, using it to have, their own pantomime monologue moments. And I think the whole thing was probably a missed opportunity in terms of learning or finding out more, for example, about redactions, what's going next with the files. The DOJ has admitted to some errors in its handling of the Epstein files, but Pam Bondi didn't repeat some of those admittances in that hearing. But I think it speaks to how in America it's become very politically charged, the Epstein files. So in the UK you have a situation where the figures in it I think are facing greater repercussions than the figures in it in America, broadly speaking. But it's also falling less along political lines. Everyone is condemning it. Here the way that the committee has worked, and that is the reason these files have been released, Congress having that act. Often it is the Democrats who will push one thing, so they will go after the Republicans, Donald Trump and others, and then the Republicans will focus on figures like Bill Clinton in it. And it's meant that it becomes really, a match of political point scoring
Sure.
a lot of the time, rather than working out what actually we need to know about kind of are more people going to be prosecuted? What is the DOJ doing on that? And when it comes to the Epstein victims, one of the reasons so many names are redacted is that we understand that Epstein often would have these victims who were, under 18, but when they hit 18, he would get them to go and bring their friends in who were younger. So sometimes the victims are also the perpetrators, which is another complication in getting these files out. But a lot of that is lost in the noise.
Right. Do we have a date yet for the Clintons testifying?
Yes, so we're expecting it at the end of the month. It's separate days, so they will have separate appearances as we currently understand it. And both Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton are pushing for this to be a public hearing, but we're not currently that's not something that the Republicans are resisting, partly because it would, of course, set a precedent if you then had senior Republicans compelled to go and speak before the committee in the future.
OK, and a very, very quick reference, if you don't mind, Katy, to this incredible story about the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, whose daughter is a very famous US news anchor. Is there still no sign of this poor lady?
There's still no sign. There are new leads, of course. The biggest development, I think, is this story is gripping America. It is leading the news bulletins. It's not Jeffrey Epstein scandal, really. It is this story that you see everywhere. And there has been a development in the sense that there is CCTV footage of, what appears to be the perpetrator in a balaclava that was released earlier this week. There are now lots of tips, tens of thousands going in. There's potentially finding bits of evidence, but still no sign. And I think, it's good the tips are coming in, but if you have tens of thousands, how do you get through them? And with every day, obviously, people grow more concerned that this is going to have at the end that people want to see.
Yeah, depressing. Thank you very much indeed, Katy. And if you'd like to hear more from Katy Balls, you can listen to her on her excellent podcast, The State of It USA. It's available wherever you get your podcasts from.